Welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive.
hmm
I am incredibly eager to get into the stack of sources we have in front of us today.
Oh, absolutely.
Because specifically for you, the listener, we are going on a journey that fundamentally plays with the concept of perspective.
It really does.
Our mission today is to explore a truly surreal 25-part narrative sourced from a YouTube channel called Max of All Trades.
Right.
The series is known simply as the Giantess. It chronicles the life of a girl named Liz, Elizabeth Hadbucks, who quite literally outgrows her world.
Yeah.
But, as I was going through these materials, it became immediately apparent that we are not just dealing with some kind of monster movie trope here.
Far from it. I mean, at first glance, the premise sounds like standard, perhaps even pulp science fiction.
Yeah,
A woman who eventually grows to the size of a mountain.
exactly.
But when you examine the text, you uncover a profoundly intricate narrative. The source material actually charts 4 distinct eras of Liz's life, meticulously tracing her physical expansion as a direct parallel to her psychological evolution.
Right, the psychology is so dense.
It is a study of a person moving through environments that are constantly trying to define her.
Okay, let's unpack this, because reading through these 25 parts, it hit me that this is a deep psychological exploration of power, privilege, and the illusion of control.
Yes.
It asks what happens when someone utterly refuses to shrink themselves down to fit the expectations of the society around them. And I want to set the mental stage for you listening right now to really visualize where this all begins.
I think the visual is crucial here.
Imagine a pristine, unsettlingly perfect Victorian nursery. It is overwhelmingly pink, immaculately clean, and honestly, a little claustrophobic in its absolute perfection.
Yeah.
Every toy is in its place. Every corner is curated.
The image perfectly represents the gilded cage of Liz's early childhood, which defines era 1 of our source material.
Yeah.
The environment she is raised in is managed to a degree that borders on total suffocation. It is a space designed by adults for adults to house a child without having to actually interact with the messiness of childhood.
Which brings up a question I want you, the listener, to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this. Have you ever felt like you had to fold yourself into a box that someone else designed?
That is the core of it, really.
Maybe it's a rigid corporate job description where you have to act a certain way, a designated role in your family dynamic, or just a broader societal expectation. Have you ever felt that intense, grinding friction of trying to make yourself smaller just to make the people around you comfortable?
Because exploring Liz's life is going to make you seriously question the invisible scale of your own life.
Exactly.
And that is the exact lens through which we need to view Liz's origins. In the earliest excerpts, she is introduced to us as a tiny entity in a room full of giants.
Yes, the giant.
The adults around her are wealthy, powerful, and completely oblivious to her internal life. They are titans of industry and socialites, and she is essentially just another piece of the furniture.
I was so struck by the scene in the first episode, titled After Party. Liz is a young child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sitting at this massive long table covered in heavy white linen.
Right.
The room is incredibly loud, voices booming over her head, and she observes the opulence around her with this chilling, almost clinical detachment.
The details in that scene are amazing.
They really are. The text describes lobster tails split cleanly down the middle, caviar served in small crystal bowls, a chef making custom omelets in the corner. And amid all this excess, she notes, quote, "I am the only child here. That doesn't make me special. It makes me invisible."
What's fascinating here is the absolute paradox of her early existence.
Yeah.
On paper, she has infinite resources. Whatever money can buy, she has access to.
Right.
Yet she possesses zero actual agency.
Right.
She is an object in the room, a decorative testament to her family's wealth. When the adults do happen to notice her, they speak to her in meaningless, hollow platitudes.
Like the woman smoothing her hair.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One woman smooths her hair without asking permission. Another calls her adorable. And Liz internalizes this, noting that adorable is not the word she wants.
Yeah.
She already understands that adorable is a dismissive term.
Yeah.
It means harmless. It means easily managed.
And speaking of management, that brings us to Mr. Whitman. He is her handler, basically her constant shadow, quiet, exact, always hovering just out of frame.
Always watching.
In this room full of oblivious, loud adults, he brings her a virgin daiquiri. But the detail that stopped me in my tracks was that she specifically notes, quote, cherry, not strawberry.
Yes, very specific.
He brings it in a real heavy glass with a tiny paper umbrella. And what does she do? She immediately pulls the umbrella out and sets it aside.
She hates it.
She doesn't want the childish decoration.
No.
She rejects the performative aspect of being a kid. She wants the adult experience, or at least the aesthetic of it.
That removal of the umbrella is a brilliant early indicator of her personality.
Yeah.
It is a tiny assertion of control in a world where she has almost none.
Yeah.
She is constantly probing the walls of her environment in these early years, testing to see where the hard limits actually are. But she quickly learns a very dark lesson about the nature of her specific type of privilege.
This is the breakfast table scene, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
In another excerpt called Princess, she asks for a gin and tonic at the breakfast table. She doesn't want to get drunk. She just wants to taste the bitter pine flavor she sees the adults consuming.
The reaction to that request is so telling. The entire room just freezes. The cook stops moving. The maid gasps. Mr. Whitman physically tenses up. They all panic because the script has been broken.
Right, a child shouldn't ask for gin.
But nobody actually yells at her. Mr. Whitman just carefully, smoothly says, perhaps another time.
Notice the tracing there.
Oh, I did.
Not a simple no, never a direct refusal. Because they are employees, and she, despite being a child, is technically their employer, or at least an extension of their employer. They cannot deny her outright.
And Liz realizes this immediately. She has this internal monologue where she notes that's what boundaries sound like when no one is allowed to say no.
Which is such a profound observation for a kid.
It really is. She can have anything she wants as long as it fits the predetermined script of a wealthy, docile child. Her life is aggressively curated. The text describes the overwhelming pinkness of her rooms. The walls, the heavy curtains, the upholstered chairs, they're all pink.
It's stifling.
The maids dress her like she's a piece of breakable inventory. She mentions that her clothes are like meals. She never wears the same outfit twice. Old clothes quietly disappear from her closet, and new ones flawlessly replace them.
Nothing lingers long enough to accumulate memories.
Exactly. Nothing ever feels like it truly belongs to her.
Consider the psychological impact of that gilded cage. When we look at highly managed environments in the real world, whether it's an intensely curated, helicopter-parented childhood or an entry-level position at a strict, heavily bureaucratic corporate firm, there is a common outcome.
Which,
When every single choice is made for you, even if those choices are luxurious or supposedly for your own good, you begin to feel like an object rather than a human being.
wow, yeah.
You're being processed by a system, not nurtured. The system prioritizes its own smooth operation over your individual autonomy.
So if you are a highly intelligent, perceptive child trapped in a system that processes you like inventory, how do you react? You look for something smaller than yourself to control.
Which brings us to the dolls.
Yes, the excerpts, dolls and Queen Bee. Reading these sections, the psychology is so thick it feels heavy. Liz is playing with her dolls, but it's not play in any traditional sense. It's the establishment of an absolute dictatorial regime.
She builds that city.
She builds a sprawling city out of blocks, paints the whole thing pink to mirror her own room, and places her tiny dolls inside. She looks at one of the dolls and thinks, I know what it's thinking. It thinks everything will be fine now. That's how they usually are. Unconditional love.
I would argue she isn't just playing. She is actively rehearsing for power. She lacks control over her own body, her schedule, her meals, all dictated by the maids and Mr. Whitman.
Right.
So she overcompensates by exerting a terrifying absolute control over miniatures. She creates an environment where she is the giant, where she is the oblivious, all-powerful adult.
But is it purely a rehearsal for power? I mean, could she just be looking for a safe space? A lot of kids build forts or dollhouses to create a manageable micro-world when the real world feels chaotic. Isn't this just a desperate coping mechanism for a child who feels totally powerless?
It functions as a coping mechanism initially, sure, but her internal monologue reveals something much darker than seeking safety. The true psychological insight comes when she imagines one of the dolls disobeying her.
Oh, this part.
In a typical child's play, a disobedient toy might be scolded or put in a timeout. Liz's reaction is entirely different.
Right, I remember this vividly. She imagines a doll standing slightly apart from the others, refusing to be impressed by her block city. And she doesn't immediately smash it in a tantrum.
No, she doesn't.
She initiates a silent countdown in her head. She imagines the doll's creeping fear. She lets it pretend it can run and hide in one of the toy buildings, giving it a false sense of hope, and only then does she slowly crumble the building in her hands.
And her realization there is chilling.
She says endings are dull. The interesting part is the space before the end, when everything is still possible.
That is the key distinction. She is learning that true dominance isn't just about the application of brute force. It's about patience. is the suspension of consequence.
Yeah.
The power lies in the target's anticipation of the crush, not the crush itself. We see this exact same philosophy transition from the miniature world to the real world when she visits a commercial honey farm in the Queen Bee episode.
The atmosphere of that honey farm scene is incredible. The author describes the air smelling like manners and warm sugar flowers disciplined into something expensive.
What a line.
She's there on a guided tour with Mr. Whitman. The head beekeeper is explaining the mechanics of the hive, how the queen is the absolute center of the system, and that without her continuous presence, the entire colony collapses into chaos.
And Liz is just watching this.
And Liz, looking at this bustling, complex system, simply demands to hold the queen.
The tension the author builds in this scene is palpable. Mr. Whitman is visibly anxious, shifting his weight. The beekeeper is deeply reluctant to hand over his most valuable asset to a child.
But again, they can't say no.
Exactly. Neither of them possesses the authority to actually tell her no. The social rules of their employment override their common sense. So the beekeeper carefully places this vital, living queen bee in the open palm of a little girl.
And Liz looks down at this tiny creature that commands thousands of fiercely loyal subjects. What does she do? She curls her fingers inward, very slightly.
Just a fraction.
Not enough to crush the bee, just enough to feel the physical limit, to discover where holding ends and owning begins. She actively wonders what it would feel like to just close her fist completely, not out of malice or anger, but simply because she wants to know that she has the capacity to do it.
A test of leverage.
Mr. Whitman murmurs a soft warning, and she opens her hand. But she makes it clear to the reader she didn't open her hand because she was scared of getting stung or getting in trouble. She opens it because, as she puts it, I'm patient.
It is a staggering level of self-awareness. She is actively analyzing the mechanics of leverage. She understands that power isn't necessarily the action of destroying something. Power is the verified capacity for action purposefully withheld.
This detached view of the world clearly stems from her parents. We haven't touched on them much yet, mostly because they are functionally absent from her daily life. But we get a clear picture in the excerpt performance review. Liz is having a formal dinner with them, and it reads exactly like a quarterly corporate evaluation. They literally bring a manila folder to the table containing her academic and extracurricular achievements.
To dinner.
Yes. Her father scans the paper and says, excellent again, but the praise feels heavy, like a checked box. Her mother is across the table, continuously scrolling on her phone, half present.
It's entirely transactional.
Liz sits there, eating her precisely plated food, and realizes that to her parents, love is measurable, care is enough.
They are instilling in her a highly transactional worldview. They're training her to view humanity from a macro level, where relationships are performance-based and emotional connection is secondary to structural success. They are executives managing a portfolio, and Liz is currently their most promising, high-yield asset.
As she grows older, we see her literal physical perspective start to align with this macro-level emotional training. In an excerpt titled Altitude, she is flying on the family's private plane, looking down at the landscape far below.
I love this scene.
She watches cars moving like tiny ants along the highways, following predetermined routes. And she experiences this profound, overwhelming sense of peace because, as she notes, distance flattens urgency.
Distance flattens urgency. That phrase is a masterpiece of psychological framing. When you are elevated far above the fray, whether that elevation is achieved by extreme wealth, social status, or, as we will see, physical height, the frantic individual struggles of humanity blur into a predictable, manageable pattern.
Yeah.
She observes from the window that individual intention collapses into pattern. She is actively soothing her own anxieties by realizing that if you get high enough up, the messy chaos of human emotion becomes entirely invisible.
It's the ultimate form of detachment. But she still has an obligation to play her assigned role when she's on the ground. In grand opening, she is forced to attend a public ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new wing of a hospital or a corporate center her family funded.
A very public event.
Her face is plastered on promotional posters and printed on coffee cups. People in the crowd are taking pictures of her, local politicians are patting her shoulder, wealthy donors are telling her she has an old soul.
They don't know her at all.
She looks out at this sea of faces and has a stark realization. These people don't want her to be a complex, breathing, flawed human being. They just need her to be a frozen, perfect symbol of philanthropy and wealth.
Exactly. They require an avatar, not a person. This marks the end of Era 1. She's transitioning from the stifling, personal control of the nursery to the broad, impersonal control of her public life. If we were to set the mental stage for what she is being prepared to inherit, imagine a sterile, expansive corporate boardroom, high above the city traffic, surrounded by thick glass walls, bathed in absolute, temperature-controlled silence.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we are crossing the threshold into era 2. Liz is a teenager now, and if you thought the social dynamics of your high school were tough to navigate, imagine trying to survive them when you were essentially treated like untouchable royalty.
It's a whole different game.
The overarching theme of this section is what the sources call social gravity and the orbit of privilege.
The shift into adolescence is a crucial pivot point in her development. In her childhood, her isolation was heavily imposed upon her by the adults in charge. But in her adolescence, her isolation becomes self-maintained through these complex social dynamics. She doesn't have friendships in any traditional reciprocal sense. She has satellites.
The concept of orbit is brilliantly explored in an excerpt of the same name. Liz is walking through a high-end luxury shopping mall with two girls from her private school, Sarah and Sydney.
Right.
But the staging of the scene is what caught my attention. They don't walk shoulder to shoulder with her like equals. They naturally flank her, stepping slightly behind. They subconsciously adjust their walking pace to match hers. When they approach a directory, Sydney asks, "Where do you want to go first?"
Not where should we go?
Exactly. She doesn't ask where should we go. The entire expedition is centered entirely on Liz's desires.
And Liz acknowledges this dynamic with her trademark clinical precision. She notes internally that Sarah and Sydney are capable, highly intelligent girls. But they actively prefer not to take the lead because decision-making requires effort and risk.
Which they want to avoid.
Liz, conversely, has been conditioned since birth to make decisions effortlessly without fear of consequence. When Sarah tries on an expensive dress and hesitates at the price tag, Liz just hands the cashier her card without a second thought. She justifies it by noting that clean exchanges are easier. She is buying their compliance to avoid the friction of a debate.
Later in that same trip, there is a moment by the glass railing on the second floor. Sydney hands Liz an iced smoothie, and the author describes how Sydney carefully angles her hand to avoid brushing her fingers against Liz's in a way that might feel too familiar or intimate.
That physical distance.
Riz watches this micro-interaction and thinks to herself that society would call this a friendship, but the more accurate word is orbit. She says, "What bothers me is when people confuse proximity with intimacy."
That realization is the defining tragedy of her teenage years. Everyone in her ecosystem wants to be near her, to bask in the radiant heat of her wealth and status. But no one actually knows her, nor do they want to. Knowing her would require treating her as a flawed equal. And Liz is becoming acutely aware of how her physical reality mirrors this social dynamic.
We see that physical reality come into sharp focus in the maintenance excerpt. The three girls are hanging out in Liz's massive showroom-quality ensuite bathroom.
A classic teenage scene.
Right. Sarah and Sydney are looking in the mirror complaining about their bodies. Sarah thinks a dress makes her look weird. Sydney is hyperfixated on a microscopic skin blemish. Typical, relatable teenage insecurities.
Okay.
Sydney looks over at Liz, who is just standing there calmly, and says, "I don't think I've ever seen you with a pimple." Liz recognizes that her perfection is creating distance, so she tries to offer them a flaw, a vulnerability, just to bridge the gap and make them feel better. She confesses that she actually hates her height.
It's a rare moment of attempted connection. She throws them a lifeline to establish common ground. But how do her quote-unquote friends react to this vulnerability?
They completely, instantly dismiss it. Sydney rolls her eyes and calls it a humble brag, pointing out that fashion models are tall. Sarah chimes in, agreeing that millions of girls would kill for that exact height.
They won't even let her have an insecurity.
They utterly reject her attempt to be normal. Liz turns back to the mirror, looking at her friends stressing over concealers and fabrics, and she has this profound thought. There are bodies that require maintenance, illusion, enchantment, transformation, and then there is mine.
She's recognizing her own inherent gravity. She realizes that she doesn't have to perform the exhausting rituals of adolescence to command space. Her sheer physical presence, which the text hints is steadily abnormally growing, does all the heavy lifting for her. We see her test the limits of this social gravity in another excerpt called Facilitated.
Oh, the leadership camp scene. She's forced to attend this elite summer program run by overly enthusiastic adults who insist on calling themselves facilitators.
Of course.
She gets paired up for a group project with a nervous, overly eager boy. She internally nicknames him Syrup Stain because he has a faint spot on his polo shirt. The moment they're grouped together, he is instantly drawn into her orbit, but the gravity makes him anxious. He keeps asking her what to do, trying to get her attention, desperately trying to create some kind of emotional rapport or shared joke.
So, given what we know about her aversion to forced intimacy, how does she handle him? Does she engage with his anxiety? Does she tell him to back off?
Neither. She uses bureaucracy as a weapon. She hands him a massive stack of index cards and tells him he needs to organize them by color, then by keyword. She invents pointless, complex busywork just to manage his focus.
That's brilliant.
She notes, I don't need his help. I give him small tasks to keep him occupied. She completely neutralizes his attempt at personal intimacy by transforming him from a peer into an employee. Later that afternoon, she watches him sweating, totally exhausted from trying to execute her pointless tasks perfectly, and she feels no empathy, only a mild irritation that he is trying so hard.
It is a brilliant, if cold, masterclass in social deflection. She builds a wall out of tasks. But the narrative shows us that she isn't completely immune to the desire for normal, grounded interactions. In fact, she actively seeks them out in a controlled environment, which leads us to her bizarre part-time job as a barista.
This scene is fantastic. She takes a job working the register and the espresso machine at a coffee shop called Hadbucks. And without spelling out the obvious corporate pun, it's clear her family's conglomerate likely owns the entire chain.
Clearly.
She shows up for her shifts wearing the standard green apron over her tailored designer clothes. And surprisingly, she absolutely loves the work. She loved the mechanical, unforgiving precision of it, steaming the milk to the exact temperature, tamping the espresso, pouring the shots. She says the machine doesn't flirt, it doesn't misunderstand, it responds to skill.
She is desperately seeking a space where cause and effect are clean and undeniable, a space free of social maneuvering. If you do the steps right, you get good coffee. If you do them wrong, you get bad coffee. But the tragedy is that she cannot escape her own context. The customers walking through the door don't treat her like a barista. They treat her like a local celebrity doing performance art.
Exactly. A businessman in a suit tries to aggressively flirt with her while she hands him his latte. A wealthy mother from her social circle stops by and tells her loudly that she's setting such a great role model for the lower classes by pretending to work.
Just awful.
And then a teenage boy from her school tries to white knight the situation, leaning over the counter and telling her she shouldn't have to pretend to do a job beneath her station.
Notice her reaction to the boy.
Yeah.
She says, "I'm not pretending." In that moment, she realizes that to the world outside, she isn't a human being making coffee. She is a walking aesthetic experience. They are consuming her presence just like they consume the drinks. She notes with a deep sense of isolation that people speak to her like a moment, an anecdote they can tell their friends later.
This inescapable isolation and the absolute inevitability of her social dominance all culminate in the prom queen excerpt. I want to spend some time here because this feels like a pivotal moment in understanding Liz's relationship with the concept of fairness.
It is arguably the most important scene in Era 2. It strips away all the illusions of high school meritocracy.
This setup is classic. It's prom night, the gym is decorated, the lights are low. You have Jasmine Serrano, the cheer captain, who has spent 4 years organizing committees and being universally liked. She's dating Chris Aaron, the quintessential golden boy quarterback. They are the picture-perfect, hardworking high school couple. Jasmine is standing near the stage, fully expecting her name to be called for prom queen because she put in the work and played the game correctly. But when the principal opens the envelope and speaks into the microphone, the name is Liz.
And pay attention to the crowd's reaction. The author specifies that the room doesn't gasp in surprise. They erupt in recognition. It is an immediate collective acknowledgement of her absolute social gravity. They didn't vote for her because she hung up posters. They voted for her because her status made it an inevitability. And then Chris Aaron is named prom king.
Now, if this were a typical teen movie, this is the moment where Chris is supposed to look at Liz, shake his head, and apologize. He's supposed to turn to Jasmine, kiss her, and say, "It's just a silly dance, I'm yours."
Right, choose love.
He's supposed to choose love over status, but he doesn't. When the spotlight hits him, he immediately steps forward, physically abandoning Jasmine on the edge of the dance floor, and walks up to take Liz's hand. He steps into his assigned role and follows Liz's lead perfectly.
The script demands it.
Liz looks over Chris's shoulder and sees Jasmine's face, tight with shock and humiliation. And Liz checks her own internal emotional state, searching for pity, and finds absolutely zero guilt.
This is a critical psychological insight for Liz. She realizes, and I quote, "Democracy doesn't choose what's fair. It chooses what fits the narrative." She understands that Chris Aaron didn't abandon his girlfriend because he suddenly fell in love with Liz. He left Jasmine because the unwritten, ironclad social script dictated that the king must dance with the queen.
Yeah.
Liz understands that social roles, at the highest level, aren't won through merit, kindness, or fairness. They are assigned by the collective, unconscious will of the crowd.
It's a heavy, almost cynical realization for someone so young. She observes the system adjusts around us as if this was always the plan. She isn't feeling triumphant or malicious toward Jasmine. She is simply confirmed in her growing belief that the world operates entirely on power, gravity, and narrative momentum rather than individual emotion.
Now, we transition to the final part of Era 2, where Liz confronts the broader, messier world outside of her highly curated high school bubble. The source material presents two distinct interactions on the street, one with a quiet homeless man and one with a vocal protester holding an Eat the Rich sign. As we analyze these encounters, we are looking purely at what these moments reveal about Liz's internal worldview and how she processes external friction. We are not taking a stance on the politics involved here.
Right, we are looking at the mechanics of her mind here completely impartially. In the excerpt titled Eat the Rich, Liz is walking alone down a busy city street. She notices a homeless man sitting quietly against a brick wall with a piece of cardboard. She observes that the pedestrians walking past are actively swerving to avoid him because his mere presence asks for something. He creates a pocket of discomfort.
He breaks the flow of the street.
Liz stops walking. She opens her designer bag, pulls out a crisp, brand new, practically weightless $100 bill, and simply hands it to him. She doesn't smile, she doesn't offer a patronizing lecture, and she doesn't wait around for him to thank her. She notes internally, the exchange is complete the moment it leaves my hand. It's less weight to carry.
It is a purely transactional moment. She is essentially paying a toll to alleviate the environmental friction. She buys a clean exit. But contrast that smooth transaction with what happens just a few blocks later. She encounters a man shouting into a megaphone, pacing back and forth with a large sign that reads, "Eat the Rich."
Yeah.
The man recognizes her. Remember, her face was on hospital wing posters. He points directly at her, yelling, calling her a spoiled, parasitic girl, trying to draw the crowd's attention to her.
And Liz stops again. But notice how she processes his anger. She doesn't feel ashamed, and she doesn't feel the urge to yell back and defend herself. She stands there, observing him like he's a bug under glass, and realizes something fascinating.
This is a key insight from her.
She notes that the man isn't actually mad at her, Elizabeth Hadbucks, the individual. He doesn't know her. He is mad at a shape he carries around with him in his head, a symbol small enough to fit on a piece of cardboard. She realizes he doesn't want structural answers or a debate. He wants friction. He wants the theater of the crowd watching him be righteously angry at the symbol she represents.
Her response to this realization is profound and very much in character. She uses silence as a weapon. She notes, "Silence denies him escalation. Silence keeps me intact." She recognizes that engaging with him, getting defensive, or even apologizing would only validate the narrative he has built and give him the scene he desperately wants.
Exactly.
By simply looking at him and walking away in total silence, she starves him of his story. She concludes the interaction by thinking, people don't want solutions, they want stories, and that is why they stay small.
That concept of staying small leads directly into one of the most surreal, visually striking, and psychologically dense moments in the entire series, the excerpt titled Narcissist. After the encounter with the protester, Liz goes back to her massive home, goes into her room, and locks the heavy door. She opens a drawer and takes out a miniature doll of herself.
The charity doll.
Yes, it's a literal, tiny, mass-produced replica that was sold as charity merchandise during one of her family's galas. She walks over to her full-length mirror, holding this tiny version of herself, acknowledging her own undeniable, growing physical presence. She places the tiny doll against her cheek and looks in the mirror, actively trying to imagine seeing herself through the plastic doll's tiny eyes.
It is a brilliant psychological exercise. She has spent her entire life being told how imposing she is, how perfect she is, how intimidating her gravity is to the people in her orbit. For the first time, she wants to genuinely feel what others feel when they are forced to look up at her. She is attempting to consume her own gravity.
She looks at her reflection, holding the miniature, and she slowly presses her lips to the top of the doll's plastic head. It is technically a kiss, but she describes the sensation as almost consuming it. She looks at herself doing this and notes, I don't feel cruel, I feel centered.
He finds peace in it.
She is fully accepting that she is her own ultimate object of desire, fascination, and control. She finishes the chapter by saying, if loving myself looks wrong, then I don't want to be right.
It is the ultimate, total rejection of the modesty, self-deprecation, and physical shrinkage that society typically demands of young women. She is embracing her power, her scale, and her absolute unapologetic control over her own image. And if we connect this psychological acceptance of her own vastness to the narrative structure, it perfectly triggers the literal physical reality of Era 3.
Which means we are moving into the era of true physical expansion. Imagine the mental stage shifting again. Picture a sleek, hyper-modern, obscenely luxurious apartment in the sky. The materials are impossibly expensive. Honed marble, brushed steel, floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass.
But the scale is off.
Yes, if you look closely at the proportions of the room, something is deeply wrong. The ceiling seems just a few inches too low. The doorways are noticeably too narrow. The expensive modernist furniture looks like it belongs in a toddler's playroom. This represents the physical manifestation of Liz's internal psychological state. She is now literally, biologically, outgrowing the world built for normal humans.
The author dives deep into the physics of this expansion in the excerpt Growth Spurt. Liz is now 18 years old, and she is well over 7 feet tall, and she is not done growing. She is at a high-end tailor for what she calls a full rebuild of her wardrobe because absolutely nothing she owned a month ago fits her body anymore.
The tailor scene is wild.
The scene describes the master tailor having to drag over a wooden step stool just to measure her shoulders. But it's not simply her vertical height that's changing, it's her physical density. Her impact on the material world is magnifying. She casually mentions to the tailor that she shattered a crystal champagne flute last week just by lifting it off a tray, underestimating her own grip strength.
The environment around her is becoming terrifyingly fragile. She notes that the physical world feels like it was built for children. And we see exactly how this physical mismatch affects her interpersonal relationships in the excerpt Proximity.
The date.
Yes. She goes out on a date with a man named Evan Cole, who is described as a highly successful, famous, leading man actor. They go to a wildly exclusive restaurant that is specifically designed for romantic intimacy. Low-slung leather chairs, tiny candlelit bistro tables. And the physical mismatch between them is almost comical, but incredibly intense. When she sits down, her knees are sitting higher than the tabletop. Evan, despite being a looting man, is almost a full foot shorter than her.
Consider Evan's reaction. He isn't repulsed. He's utterly fascinated by her. He tells her across the tiny table, it's grounding being around someone who doesn't apologize for taking up space. Evan is a celebrity. He is entirely used to being the center of attention, the focal point of any room he enters. But sitting across from Liz, he is completely effortlessly overshadowed by her natural physical gravity.
The power dynamic is just so visual. He even asks her, almost nervously, what her shoe size is. She doesn't blush or deflect. She takes a sip of her drink and calmly tells him, women's 18.
She owns it.
During the dinner, she effortlessly consumes 2 massive, heavy entrees, while Evan nervously pushes a salad around his plate, his appetite ruined by proximity to an apex predator. When the date ends and they part ways on the sidewalk, she offers her cheek. He has to stretch upward to kiss it gently, looking up at her with genuine awe. She turns and walks away, leaving this famous, powerful man standing on the curb, completely captivated and entirely diminished by her scale.
But that immense scale comes with a heavy, grinding daily price when you are forced to navigate a world that wasn't built for it. In the excerpt Claustrophobic, we return to that luxurious, sky-high apartment we pictured earlier. The reality of her daily life inside it is a constant, irritating friction.
Reading the descriptions of her routine sounds physically exhausting. The kitchen counters hit her at mid-thigh, which means she has to painfully fold her spine in half just to chop vegetables or use the sink. The luxury rainfall shower head hits her square in the chest, so she has to crouch awkwardly in the steam just to wash her hair. When she tries to relax and sit on her expensive sculptural designer couch, the foam compresses entirely under her dense weight, offering zero support. At one point, out of sheer frustration, she intentionally knocks a heavy designer lamp off an end table.
A tiny rebellion.
But it doesn't shatter in a satisfying crash. It just tips over politely and rolls on the thick rug. The apartment absorbs her rebellion without acknowledging it. She sits there and realizes wealth, buys proximity. It buys the illusion that everything can be fixed by replacing it. It does not buy relief from suffocation.
That is the absolute limit of her privilege.
Mhm.
Her immense wealth can buy her a beautifully appointed sky-high cage, but it cannot alter the fundamental restrictive dimensions of that cage. She is bone-tired of ducking her head through door frames designed for average people. She asked herself a profound philosophical question. What does it mean to build a world for yourself when no one else needs to live in it?
Her answer is to stop adapting her body to the world and force the world to adapt to her body. She commissions a massive, custom-built architectural project, a house scaled entirely for her dimensions. We see the final result in the excerpt threshold. By the time it's finished, she is well over 12 feet tall. The house features massive, echoing corridors, 20-foot ceilings, and gigantic, heavy furniture built to withstand her density.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, notice the specific language the author uses to describe the house: responsive and quiet. For the first time in her entire life, she is moving through an environment that does not silently demand that she fold, tuck, or apologize for her existence.
And then Evan Cole comes to visit her new home. He rings the doorbell, and when Liz opens the massive door, she has to angle her head incredibly far down to see him on the porch. He's completely dwarfed by the sheer scale of the entryway. He looks up at her and says, "I couldn't reach the handle."
And her response?
And Liz, without a hint of sympathy, just looks down and says, "I know, that's on purpose." She invites him in and guides him through the massive rooms. Evan trails behind her, visibly terrified by this environment that renders him functionally helpless. He walks into the kitchen and realizes he can't even see over the countertops. When they sit at the dining table, his feet dangle off the edge of the chair, swinging in the air like a toddler.
The social and physical power dynamic has completely inverted from the traditional male-female norm. Evan, the famous wealthy actor, is now reduced to the role of a fragile doll inside Liz's perfectly ordered, oversized domain. He is the miniature. And strangely, he leans into his own diminishment. He asks her to take her heels off so he can stand next to her and compare his normal-sized foot to her massive one.
And while he's looking at the sheer difference in size, he asks the ultimate intrusive question. It's described as a thought escaping his mouth too quickly, driven by morbid curiosity. He asks, looking up at her, "What if you stepped on me?"
A crazy thing to ask.
Now, Liz doesn't laugh it off as a joke. She doesn't act playfully horrified. She looks down at him with flat, cold eyes and says softly, "I'd kill you." He swallows hard and says he knows he just wanted to know what it would feel like to be under that kind of pressure. But she refuses to indulge his weird fantasy. She leaves her massive barefoot resting next to his on the floor and just watches him sweat. She is choosing restraint over spectacle, exercising the exact same patience she used when holding the queen bee as a child.
She is fully, consciously aware of her lethality now. She doesn't need to exercise it to prove it exists. The mere threat of her physics is enough. This quiet, terrifying realization of her absolute physical power leads us directly into one of the most symbolically dense moments in the entire narrative, the excerpt withdrawal.
I have to say, this scene is incredibly cinematic. Liz decides to take a walk through a massive public park in the center of the city. She's 12, maybe 13 feet tall now. The text describes her massive shadow moving along the grass ahead of her, dark and sharp, like it already knows where it's going.
The people's reactions are great.
The normal-sized people in the park are stopping dead in their tracks, staring, whispering frantically, pulling their children close to their sides in instinctual terror. But Liz ignores them. She walks to the very center of the park and stops in front of a massive bronze statue of a visionary founder, a historical man on a high stone pedestal.
Consider the heavy symbolism at play here. It is a bronze patriarch, the literal, physical embodiment of historical, male-dominated institutional power. For centuries, statues like this have been elevated on pedestals, designed to be permanent, designed to force normal people to literally look up to them and demand respect. But when you are a 13-foot-tall woman standing right next to it, the scale completely shifts. You are looking the bronze man dead in the eye. He isn't imposing anymore. He's just a chunk of shaped metal.
Liz reaches out and rests her massive fingers against the cold bronze shoulder of the statue. She taps it, noting the hollow, echoing sound it makes. She has a moment of reflection, thinking about how women's bodies are historically expected to be decorative, placed softly around the edges of society, while men like this bronze founder claim the solid, immovable center. And then she simply pushes it.
She doesn't wind up or brace herself.
She doesn't wind up, she doesn't throw a tantrum. She just applies steady, horizontal pressure against the bronze chest. The text notes that the statue resists for a split second, purely out of structural habit, and then the bolts snap. It tips backward. The stone pedestal cracks violently, the metal groans, and the heavy bronze head slams into the pavement with a deafening crash.
And pay close attention to what she does next. She doesn't strike a victory pose.
No, she steps forward, lifting her leg, and her heavy heel comes down squarely on the bronze face. But again, she doesn't stomp in rage. She just places her foot there, shifts her immense weight forward, and lets physics finish the thought.
Physics finishes the thought.
The thick bronze caves in under her density, flattening like a soda can. The rigid expression of historical authority completely collapses. The people in the park are screaming, holding up their phones, recording her, calling it an act of madness. But standing over the crushed metal, Liz feels absolutely no triumph and definitely no guilt. She thinks to herself, the statue mattered because everyone agreed it did. I didn't argue. I withdrew my agreement.
I withdrew my agreement.
Yeah.
That phrase is arguably the thesis statement of the entire deep dive. She realizes that all societal structures, whether they are literal bronze statues in a park, invisible corporate hierarchies, or deeply ingrained social expectations, only hold weight if the collective populace agrees to bear that weight. By knocking the founder over with minimal effort, she violently exposes the fragile, fictional nature of that agreement.
Which makes me want to pause the narrative for a second and ask you, the listener, to reflect on your own environment. What bronze statues exist in your life right now? In your specific industry, in your family tree, in your social circles? What rigid structures or expectations only have power over you because you and everyone else around you have unconsciously agreed to grant them that power? What would actually happen tomorrow if you simply woke up and withdrew your agreement?
It is a highly provocative question. And as Liz formally withdraws her agreement from the rules of the human world, she begins to move beyond human scale entirely. Imagine the mental stage shifting for the final massive time. We are no longer indoors. We are no longer even in a park. We are perched on a towering, awe-inspiring mountain peak, looking down through the clouds at a human city that appears no larger than a textured gray rug. We have entered Era 4, the queendom, and the scale of apathy.
This is where the narrative shifts from grounded psychology into something surreal, mythic, and genuinely terrifying. In the excerpt Morsels, Liz wakes up from a deep sleep and she realizes she was wearing her massive custom-built house like a tight, restrictive coat. She has grown exponentially during the night, undergoing a massive, violent biological shift. The reinforced walls of the custom house splinter and give way around her.
She bursts right out of it.
She stands up, the roof caving in, shedding the architecture like a discarded costume. She is now a true, towering giantess, her head in the cloud line, casting a shadow over the entire valley.
And how does humanity, down on the ground, respond to a biological entity that is scaled so far past their comprehension, their morality, and their military defenses? They do exactly what human beings have done since the dawn of time. When faced with the overwhelming and the incomprehensible, they drop to their knees and worship it.
A massive crowd of tiny humans gathers at the edge of her ruined property line. They bring pathetic, desperate offerings, hand-woven blankets, bundles of flowers, a single loaf of bread. They kneel in the dirt. One brave person at the front of the crowd uses a megaphone to shout up at her, "We love you, Liz."
Such a desperate move.
And Liz, hearing this tiny, tinny voice, actually laughs. The sound rumbles like thunder. She slowly lowers her massive body, her shadow folding over the crowd like a dark blanket, and she decides to name them. She says, her voice echoing off the valley walls, "You are the morsels." She looks at their terrified, adoring faces and tells them flatly, "If I wanted to eat you, you wouldn't be alive."
Now, the terrifying part is the crowd loves it. They weep with relief. They start chanting the word morsels over and over like it's a sacred gift. She realizes in that moment that these people don't actually want freedom or autonomy. They want the comfort of belonging to an entity that is so powerful it doesn't even need them. She is seamlessly stepping into the archetype of a cruel, indifferent deity. She muses internally. If they want a goddess, I can give them one. If they want a ritual, I can give them choreography. She accepts their pathetic worship not out of ego, but because at her current incomprehensible scale, it's the only form of interaction that registers as structurally logical.
But she doesn't just stay isolated on her mountain hill. In the excerpt Mice, her adoring morsels inform her that there are other people hiding deep within the concrete canyons of the city, people who are terrified of her and refuse to worship. And Liz, out of sheer boredom, decides to play a game.
The hide-and-seek game.
She crawls down from the hills and enters the city on all fours. The author's description of this perspective shift is mind-bending. Streetlights blink confusedly against her knees, wide highways look like narrow ribbons, and dark alleys become tiny, fascinating trails. She initiates a massive, terrifying game of hide and seek. She drags her fingernail along the roof of a six-story apartment block, peeling it back slightly, and peers inside, whispering, "Found one."
What she is doing here is turning the actual, lived-in urban landscape into an exact replica of her childhood nursery. The real city, with its millions of lives, is functionally no different to her now than the little pink block city she built as a child. And the people cowering inside those buildings, when they finally realize she isn't going to crush them, they slowly come out into the streets. They applaud her, they cheer for her terrifying mercy. She smiles down at them, names them her mice, and officially welcomes them to her queendom.
But there is always an anomaly, someone who doesn't fit the neat categories of worship or fear. Which brings us to a deeply chilling excerpt titled Specs. Liz is looking down at a vast concrete parking lot, and she spots a single man standing entirely alone. He isn't kneeling like a morsel, and he isn't hiding like a mouse. He's just standing there staring up at her blankly.
He's not playing the game.
So she reaches down from the sky with two massive fingers, pinches the air around his tiny body, and effortlessly lifts him thousands of feet into the air.
The internal monologue during this action is vital. She categorizes him in her mind as a fleck, a dot, a speck. She thinks about how he could be literally anyone down there, a high school teacher, a grocery store cashier, a man whose disappearance will barely register a blip on the news cycle. She is aggressively stripping him of his humanity and individuality, reducing him to pure matter.
She holds him up close to her massive eye. She starts narrating his internal thoughts out loud, treating him like a toy, imagining that he's frantically trying to decide whether to be paralyzed by terror or overwhelmed by awe. She tells him, her voice vibrating the air in his lungs, that he is officially her new doll. She lifts him even higher, letting the sprawling city drop away beneath them until it looks like a circuit board. She whispers to him, "You don't have to choose how to feel anymore. That's my job."
And then what does she do?
And then, with absolutely no change in her heart rate, she casually opens her fingers and drops him. She watches him fall and thinks, abracadabra, he's no longer a speck. Let's just say he's in a better place now.
It is a moment of total, absolute apathy. She has scaled completely past the evolutionary concept of human empathy. The life of a single individual human being plunging to their death is as emotionally inconsequential to her as dropping the plastic doll into the toy box when she was a 5-year-old in the nursery.
But, as with any regime, not everyone is ready to just accept being classified as a morsel, a mouse, or a speck. Which brings us to the final conflict in the narrative. Spanning the excerpts, the boring, and the queen, we see the formation of a desperate resistance.
Right, protesters.
Now, notice how Liz processes this resistance purely through her own psychological framework. A massive crowd of angry protesters gathers in the ruined city streets below her. They are holding up hastily painted signs, screaming chants through megaphones, explicitly calling her a monster. They demand that she leave their territory, that she disappear, or that the military blow her out of the sky. Again, keeping our neutral analysis here, we are just looking at her reaction.
They are desperately trying to force her back into a comprehensible historical narrative. If she is a monster, then they are the righteous victims, and the universe makes sense again. The text explicitly describes the protesters as fear, wearing the costume of certainty. To prove their point, some of them start hurling stones and loose bricks up at her massive legs. Now, technically, at her colossal scale, a brick hitting her shin is just tactile information. It poses zero physical threat. But it still registers. A brick shatters loudly against her skin.
And Liz feels a flash of genuine, world-ending anger. She possesses the physical mass to step forward and effortlessly pulverize the entire crowd into dust, but she doesn't do it. Because she understands exactly what the psychology of the crowd demands. They want a martyr. They want to sacrifice a body big enough to carry all of their collective dread so they can feel right and just about the world again. They desperately want her to act like a monster so they can blame her for their insignificance.
And she absolutely, categorically refuses to grant them that absolution. She refuses to apologize for her size, she refuses to shrink away in shame, and she absolutely refuses to play the violent role of the monster they wrote for her. Instead, she lifts her massive foot and steps down hard on the empty street next to them, deeply fracturing the asphalt and sending out a shockwave, just to physically prove she cannot be moved. She lifts her arms in a gesture of grand presentation, and her voice booms over the city, "I'm not leaving and I'm not shrinking."
She turns her back on the screaming crowd, leaving them to choke on their own impotent panic, and slowly walks to the very edge of the city. She finds the highest mountain peak and sits down heavily as the sun begins to set. And from up there, she just watches the city below her frantically recalibrate around her permanent existence. Traffic physically reroutes around her massive footprints. Emergency service patterns form new grids. The human system doesn't stop functioning. It just desperately adapts to the undeniable fact of her geography.
She has transcended being a person. She's become a permanent geographic feature, a literal looming landmark of philosophy. She looks down and thinks, this isn't exile. Exile requires borders, someone else deciding where you don't belong. I wasn't pushed out, I expanded. She sits there, perfectly still, watching the sun slip behind her massive shoulder, allowing her unimaginably large shadow to slowly plunge half the city into deep, cold darkness. She doesn't move. She doesn't need to ever again.
Reading that, it feels like the ultimate definitive ending to the saga, the god resting on the mountain, the stifling world finally conquered by sheer scale. But then you turn the page and we get to episode 25, the final excerpt titled After Hours. So what does this all mean?
This raises an incredibly important paradigm-shifting question, because the text in this final excerpt completely and utterly upends the physical reality we've spent the last hour meticulously analyzing.
The scene opens with a single line from Liz. The crown comes off easier than it ever went on. She reaches up, takes a crown off her head, and sets it down on a laminate counter. There is no massive booming sound. There is no earthquake. The perspective shifts rapidly. We realize she is wearing a faded hoodie, comfortable sweatpants, and fuzzy socks. She is entirely remarkably normal-sized, and she is not sitting on a mountain peak. The text reveals she is standing in the small galley kitchen of a spaceship.
The author writes, "The ship hums quietly around me. Systems running, lights dim to space that doesn't ask me to fill it."
And the details here are so jarring. She reaches under the counter and pulls out a cheap plastic stepping stool, the exact kind of undignified, functional object no one would ever be allowed to photograph her with during Era 1. She steps up on it just to reach a sticky bottle of cherry syrup on the top shelf. She mixes the syrup with a splash of cheap rum in a regular glass. She walks into the living quarters and picks up the doll from the couch. And as a reader, you are left reeling. Is the doll the actual human man she dropped from the sky, somehow shrunk down? Is it literally just a plastic toy? We have no idea. She puts on a pair of noise-canceling headphones and hits play on a generic pop song. And the author specifically includes a lyric from the song playing in her ears. "I've got money on the Starbucks app."
Not Hadbucks.
Starbucks!
Exactly, not Hadbucks. The real world intrudes.
It is an incredibly jarring, masterful juxtaposition. Stripped of the adoring crowds, the screaming protesters, the golden cages, and the massive displays of physical power, she is ultimately just a solitary person standing in a quiet kitchen hurtling through the dark. The narrative intentionally leaves us with profound structural ambiguity.
It changes everything. Consider the possibilities. Was the entire story of her growth a literal sci-fi event taking place inside a hyper-advanced virtual reality simulation? Is she actually an alien observer who just finished a grueling, immersive shift studying human sociology? Or, perhaps most compellingly, was the entire Giantess narrative a profound, elaborate psychological metaphor? The intense, dissociative fantasy of a normal woman who felt so completely stifled and marginalized by the real world's expectations that she had to imagine herself outgrowing the entire planet just to find a moment of internal peace.
She stands there in her quiet kitchen, drinking a beverage that is a little too sweet, holding a plastic object that is perfectly small, listening to a repetitive pop song. And as the music slowly fades out, she looks at the viewport into the blackness of space and asks herself three simple, devastating questions. Who am I? What am I? Where am I? And she doesn't answer them. She doesn't even try. She just lets the song end in silence.
It forces us to heavily consider the quiet, unobserved moments after we finish performing our designated roles for the world. When the metaphorical crown comes off, when the audience leaves the theater and you are finally alone in a room that doesn't ask you to be anything, what is actually left of your identity?
What a phenomenal, mind-bending journey. We started with a stifled, invisible child trapped in a pink room, followed her as she became a queen orbiting high school dynamics, watched her transform into a towering giantess, shattering bronze statues and dropping men from the sky, and finally ended with a solitary figure on a spaceship sipping cherry rum in sweatpants. This entire source material brilliantly uses the extreme concept of physical scale to explore the universal, desperate human desire for agency, control, and the fundamental right to simply exist without having to constantly apologize for the space you take up.
And that profound ambiguity at the end leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over as you step back into the reality of your own life. The narrative of Liz strongly suggests that true power isn't about successfully getting the world to love you, nor is it about getting the world to fear you. True power is the internal realization that the world's rules, its hierarchies, and its bronze statues only apply to you if you actively agree to be the right size for them.
That's a great point.
But I would take it one step further and ask you to consider the psychological cost of that realization. If Liz's entire journey of becoming a mountain-sized queen was in fact just a dissociative daydream of a normal-sized woman hiding on a spaceship, does that make her mental escape a brilliant triumph of self-preservation? Or is it the ultimate tragedy of someone who couldn't figure out how to live in the real world, so she simply retreated into her own mind?
That is the question that lingers. If you woke up tomorrow and realized you had suddenly outgrown the expectations, the relationships, and the tightly constructed rooms you currently inhabit, would you try to painfully shrink yourself back down to fit, or would you let the house splinter around you and step outside, even if stepping outside meant being entirely alone? Thank you for joining us on this custom deep dive. Keep questioning the scale of your own world.